how some of the material that we've studied so far is relevant to this. Okay? So obviously, we're switching gears in several ways. One is, we started out with a problem that was in the Great Plains in western United States, and the client was a federal agency. Then we came to look at Kentucky and the Mississippi River Basin generally, and our client was a producer group, Kentucky Farmers and the Kentucky Farm Bureau. And so now we're going to an urban area in Florida, the Tampa, St. Petersburg, Clearwater area, or the Tampa Bay metropolitan area, and our client is a public interest group. Okay, so our client is the Tampa Bay Justice Coalition. This is a fictional group that I've created for this problem, but you pretty much have what you need to know there from the facts in the problem as to the kinds of issues and concerns that they have. So now we're going to look at how we go about representing an organization like a public interest organization that is focused on environmental justice issues in neighborhoods that have particular vulnerability to those issues. So before we get started addressing the problem, let me just see what questions there are. In your reading for if they come to you, just ask. But while you're thinking about, do you have any questions? Let me also point out there is in the reading for today a Brownfields Program Annual Report from the Environmental Protection Commission of Hillsborough County. We will really incorporate that into Wednesday's class because that's what talks about brownfields. But I wanted to kind of space out the reading, okay? So in order for you not to have a bigger chunk at one time. And then also there is a EPA document, Coastal Property Impacts Environmental Justice, which focuses particularly on the Tampa Bay area, and we will deal with that a week from Wednesday when we talk about climate change. Okay? So just so you're aware and remember those documents are out there. But we're not going to really necessarily address them directly today. Okay? One more chance, questions? No? All right. So let's start looking at this problem. So our client here is the Tampa Bay Justice Coalition. Okay, and this is public interest and focused on communities that are low income and communities of color, or we could think of those as communities with racial and ethnic minorities, and we'll talk about that at some point, but that's the focus, all right? So what is the problem? How are we going to frame the problem?
So communities that are low income and communities of color are they generally overlap in terms of characteristics of those two communities, and they happen to be situated on the short end of the social stick in terms of where they have to live and what businesses and industries are around them.
Okay.
When they live there for so long, there are long-term health effects, and it includes sorts of redevelopment. It reaffirms a sort of quasi-segregation sort of existence that disproportionately affects these people rather than us people. So
okay, all right. See what other or additional kinds of ways of looking at the problem folks might have?
Just kind of adding what Pierce said, enforcement of environmental regulations are big, even though laws may be there, they're just not enforced in these areas.
Okay, all right, good. So enforcement also an issue. Okay, so Pierce really emphasized disparities in conditions across a range of factors. Things poverty, health conditions, environmental conditions. And Olivia has emphasized also disparities in enforcement of environmental laws.
We also have to make sure that the people in these communities are actually part of the decision as well, and they get involved in all the processes.
Okay, so an issue in terms of barriers and obstacles to participation in environmental decision making. Okay, good. Well, another, we've done this sort of through two major problems. We also did a little bit to some degree with the Martin County sort of initial case study for the class. So let's think about how we might do this maybe a different way, which is let's go ahead and list what the issues are, because that actually is something that oftentimes it fits a little bit more with what you do in law school. And besides that, the problem sort of lays out many of the issues, and we can expand on what's in the problem. But let's go ahead and get that laid out, and then come back to how we would frame the problem. Right? So we did that the other day. We kind of talked around, talked about this issue and that issue, and eventually we came to a broader framing of the problem. So what are some of the issues here? Brownfields. Okay, brownfields. Brownfields. Okay, which are what?
Contaminated sites.
Contaminated sites. So just brownfields. Okay, brownfields plus industrial sites. Plus what?
Superfund sites?
Okay, Superfund sites. Okay, so all Superfund sites are brownfields, but not all brownfields are Superfund sites. Okay, so we'll talk about that later. We're going to have a reading on that for Wednesday's class. But okay, what else? So when we talk about brownfields and Superfund sites, what are we talking about?
there are areas of contaminated soil, so if that area is prone to flooding, all of those chemicals will then be spread to other areas of the environment and also land into rivers and streams and the Gulf.
Okay, so they're contaminated. You said the soils are contaminated, but then you said, well, the water can be contaminated, right? Okay? What happens if there are toxic chemicals that are not in the soil, but they are instead in drums or on the pavement? Does that count? Right, okay, so in other words, what we want to do is get beyond just soil. Soil contamination is a piece of this, right? But we want to talk about contaminated sites, right? So places where it might be soil, it might be facilities that are contaminated, it might be storage of hazardous waste or hazardous substances, it might be contaminated water, okay? Contaminated surface water, contaminated groundwater, okay? So you might remember I mentioned the biggest Superfund site in the US at one time was actually the Clark Fork in Montana. I remember we talked about the different sort of watershed-based groups, right? So that was actually the water and the stream bed that was contaminated with all of that mining waste and so forth. And so it wasn't necessarily, you know, a industrial facility per se. It was mining waste in the river. So we got contaminated sites, and one of the problems with this area, one of the challenges with this area is brownfields can be sites that are not only demonstrably contaminated, but also they can be considered sites that are perceived to be contaminated, right? We might or might not have good data, good studies to show what are the contamination levels, but because of their historic usage, because of where they are, because of what they look like, etc., people perceive that they are contaminated, okay? So we've got a whole series of possibilities, and then all of those words are all about sites, but part of the problem is just exposure to pollution, exposure to contamination, to various substances that are bad for health, bad for the neighborhood, etc. Okay? So that's one set of issues. What else? Yes.
A lack of blue-green infrastructure investment.
Okay, good. So green and blue infrastructure. So when we talk about the lack of green and blue infrastructure in these communities, what are we talking about? That sounds like a very, you know, sort of, I took an environmental law class and now I talk about green and blue infrastructure. But really, if you go to the community, what does it mean?
Green space, parks,
Green space, parks, what else?
tree canopy.
Okay, trees, tree canopy, forest. Okay, so number of terms, we'll get into those a little bit more later. What else?
Well-functioning water systems.
Okay, well-functioning okay, watersheds. What other water systems do we have?
Rivers.
Rivers,
Streams.
streams, and
Riparian areas.
riparian zones. Okay, good. And is that
Groundwater.
okay? We should have groundwater. And what else is going to be? What else is a part of the relationship between land and water that's really important?
Coast.
Okay, so we could put coastal zones and bays.
Beaches?
So coastal zones, okay.
Wetlands.
Yes, wetlands, right? We spent a whole bunch of time on 404. Wetlands, woo! All right, we got there. Like, that's our this class ever again. Okay, we go to the answer. Okay, wetlands, yes. All right, so a whole variety of aspects. So this is all the blue part of it, right? I mean, some of it's green as well, right? But it's, right, okay, good. Now, some of the stuff is not talked about as much, but, you know, wildlife is a piece of this, and wildlife habitat. So, you know, we're not talking about, you know, mountain lions running around the Tampa area. We're talking everything from birds to you know, frogs and you know, other kinds of amphibians and you know, other kinds of wildlife that exist well in urban areas. And we know that has, you know, that has a lot of impact on people who live in the area. That if you live in a community that has some wildlife, you know, there are ways in which that contributes to your certainly your mental and emotional growth, but also usually your health is one of the factors that kind of contributes to that. And if your area is pretty devoid of wildlife and so forth, it is a more diminished experience, especially with our kids growing up. Okay, so what else? Yes, sir.
And going with that is like a lot of exposed intangible surfaces like metal and cement.
Okay.
Really.
Okay, so alternatives to impervious surfaces. Again, this has a lot of different kind of names and so forth, but what we know is whether it's wetlands, which are over here, or riparian zones, okay, so they're kind of doing double duty there, but you have things like rain gardens, things are called bioswales, okay, so a swale is basically kind of a drainage ditch, but the bioswale is one that has you know, living matter in it, right, so whether it's grasses or plants or shrubs or whatever, it's not just some concrete lined drainage ditch, that kind of thing. Those sorts of things will help considerably hold and manage stormwater runoff, which can have can limit flooding in the area, can limit the amount of pollution. And so when instead the community has substantial amounts of what we're really gray infrastructure, right, so pavement of various sorts and non-biotic structures of different sorts, what that means is you get a lot of runoff, as well as when we get to things like the urban heat island effects. So that's another issue. Oops. What the heck are urban heat island effects?
The increase in temperature in urban areas due to gray infrastructure, really all the concrete surfaces, absorb the heat, so the cause of that urban campus, like 12 degrees warmer on average than rural areas.
Exactly. So there are large differences in the heat and the temperature in urban areas, okay, in comparison to rural areas. And that is in part due to the amount of concrete and other sort of surfaces. And it has a little bit less to do with whether it's impervious or not, and more to do with the extent to which it holds the heat, right? Okay, so, I mean you all know this, right? I mean, you step out on a street or a sidewalk on a hot day, you're barefoot, it's darn hot, right? I mean, everybody talks about we can fry an egg on the sidewalk, right? That sort of idea, okay? So that is a phenomenon, but it happens not only with you know, things like streets and sidewalks, but also roofs, right? Roofs of buildings. And so what's happening in the urban area, you have a higher concentration of all that, right? The amount of artificial or human-created material that is holding the heat and creating heat that in the area is greater in comparison to, say, for example, vegetation and some of this green and blue infrastructure, which will actually, in the end, be cooler. Then you have more of the green and blue out in the rural areas. Okay, but what else? What else do you think contributes to the urban heat island effects? Let's think about this for a moment. What else is going on in the urban area that is contributing to urban heat islands?
Lack of green blue infrastructure,
Okay, so
parks and trees that filter out the heat.
Right, so lack of green and blue infrastructure that have these mitigating effects. Absolutely. What else?
I mean, people and cars and everything that happen in the city create more heat, and it's all hyper-concentrated as opposed to rural areas.
All right, so you've got concentration. And you've got concentration of people. People generate heat, right? Okay. You know that a entirely full classroom OAO is unbearably hot. It is not quite so unbearably hot if the room is only half full, right? I mean, we're all generating heat, right, from our bodies. So if you get a high concentration of people, it's going to generate heat. But even more importantly, is a high concentration of vehicles, right? You've got all those vehicles, they're generating heat, they're putting exhaust into the air and so on and so forth, and it is elevating the heat in a way that where you have lower concentrations, it's not as much, right? Okay. So you've got heat coming from people, you've got heat coming from cars. What about from buildings? Okay, so we talked about the roofs and all that kind of stuff. But what's happening with the buildings that, ironically enough, is generating much heat? Yes, air conditioning units in the summer, right? All that air conditioning is. I mean, it's maybe cooling the inside of the building, but it's putting heat into the outside of the building. Okay, in a really pretty substantial way. So again, when you have a high concentration of that, then that ends up being being a problem. And it's sort of ironically, it gets worse, right? So the more that the temperatures in your neighborhood are going up, and the more you run the air conditioner, the more that the temperatures are going up in your neighborhood, right? Because you're spewing all that stuff out into the environment. Okay, so a number of different issues there. Okay, what else?
These urban heat islands, temperatures are often higher than they are in rural or suburban areas, so the electric bills are higher for the people that live there.
Okay, so with urban heat island effects, then there ends up being these really significant economic effects, right? There's a feedback, a bad feedback loop, or undesirable feedback loop, where they run the air conditioner, their electric bills go up, and they are people with more limited financial resources, and so that's a problem. So then they have to make choices: do they run the air conditioning as much? If not, then they're experiencing the heat worse. That leads to poor health conditions. Okay, and by the way, urban heat ends up being a contributor to illness and death. Okay, so we know there are correlations there. Yeah.
Oh, another issue is climate change.
Climate change, okay? So climate change is another big issue, and it's connected with some of these other issues. Okay, so how is that playing out here in the Tampa Bay area? Go ahead.
It's predicted that they'll have worse hurricanes, and they also think that the models might even not be predicting the strength of devastation that could actually happen.
Right, okay, so the issue has to do with vulnerability to hurricanes and among other things. Obviously, as you look at sort of the United States as a whole, right, Florida is a frequent place of hurricanes, and some fairly severe ones, and so forth. And so if the sort of patterns that we're seeing where hurricanes are, there are more of them, they are more intense, more destructive, more harmful to communities and so forth, then basically that whole sort of idea that unprecedented is the new normal, right? We talked about before, that the effects of hurricanes on these communities are going to be significant. And the effects on, and we're going to get into this more later, but let's go ahead and try to tackle some of this. So let's talk a little bit about just hurricanes, and we'll do a kind of a combination of hurricane storms and storm surge. Okay, so tropical storms are also relevant, while they're not quite as severe and destructive. They can be, and again, if you have a whole bunch of them, that'll be significant. And then storm surge is really about sort of the flooding, the coastal flooding that happens, whether it's from hurricanes or storms or whatnot. Okay, so we'll put that all together, sort of a cluster. Impacts on low-income communities of color. Okay? This is actually a little bit, so if you pay close attention to the reading on coastal property impacts and environmental justice and sort of the social vulnerability index, it's a little more complicated than just saying low-income communities of color are most likely to be in the path of the hurricanes. Okay? So if you had just looked at, for example, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which now is quite a long time ago, but if you just look at that in and of itself, we know that low-income communities of color were disproportionately affected. Okay? But it wasn't just the location. The location was part of it. So the lower Ninth Ward, for example, which was very much affected, was well below sea level and was especially vulnerable physically or environmentally. Okay, so that is true. But when we sort of look more broadly, there definitely are parts of the world where the most vulnerable locations are also where low-income people, racial and ethnic minority groups, and so forth live. Okay, but that's not exactly the case in every part of the United States, right? Okay, so what you want to maybe want to sort of take a stab at ways in which exposure to hurricanes or exposure to storms and storm surge might actually occur in areas that are not low income. Anybody want to take a stab at that?
It's usually really expensive to live in certain parts of Florida in the coastal areas, and especially high-rise condos that low income will can't afford. And so those are most likely places to be hit first. But at the same time, those people are most likely to have secondary residences somewhere else, so they're not as affected economically as low income people start their entire livelihood.
Exactly. Okay, good.
As mentioned, those people who live on coastal areas probably are more affected upfront, but they also have insurance, better policies in place than those who are covered by that one.
Okay, good. So the key here really is the combination of geographic vulnerability and social vulnerability, right? That's the key. So a lot of places that have a high degree of geographic vulnerability are also places that are very well off. They're expensive places to live, right? Okay. So I mean, it's not hurricanes, and it's not it's not here in Tampa. But just think, for example, about the various and sundry destructions of homes in Malibu, California. Okay, those homes are zillions of dollars in value, right? They're wealthy people, right? Right? And we're not talking about the low income communities there. I mean, Malibu is a very expensive place to live, but part of why it's a very expensive place to live is people want to be up on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, but eventually their home slides into the ocean, or their, where they get their home burns down in the wildfires, or whatever, right? Because they're in places that are geographically vulnerable. And the geographic vulnerability, in some ways, relates to or correlates in some ways to the exposure, to the value. But the problem is to step one step back and look at places with some degree of geographic vulnerability that are in those places that vulnerability is multiplied by the social vulnerability, by the fact that people do not have the resources to leave, right? They do not have the resources to adapt. They do not have the insurance. That they do not have the protections. So you can be certain that if you have high-income areas on the coast, there are all sorts of activities that are undertaken, all sorts of infrastructure that's put in place, whether you're talking about seawalls, or you're talking about beach renourishment, so whether you're putting sand back on the beach, beach stabilization projects, so forth. Those are going to happen more often, more frequently in places that are higher income because A, there's a tax base for it, and, right, and B, there's the political pressure for it, right? The communities that are lower income, maybe they're not directly on the front. The front of the path of the hurricane, but they may be very likely to flood, and those folks are just don't have the adaptive capacities. They're going to lose whatever homes or habitation they have. They may lose their possessions. They may be stuck there and therefore at risk, in terms of their health and safety and so on and so forth. So that ends up being an issue. What else on climate change? What else is climate change going to cause to happen in the Tampa Bay area? Temperatures? Yes. So temperatures, heat and humidity, right? Heat and humidity. And this, again, may intersect with urban heat island effects, but it has it's a phenomenon that exists in addition to or independently of urban heat island effects. Okay, so this may be all over the region, and it may be worse in places with urban heat island effects. It may make those situations worse, but again, when you start thinking about climate change and rising temperatures, rising humidity, that's going to make things very uncomfortable and unpleasant, which ultimately, for people who have limited resources for air conditioning, for alternative places to spend time, who live in communities with urban heat island effects, all of those are going to mean that those people's health is at greater risk. Right? So it becomes a health issue. Right? Okay. Anything else we want to talk about? Okay. Just want to. So another thing is just changing ranges that happen as the climate changes, and so you get sort of to some degree migrations. Okay, and I think we talked about this before. Although I maybe remembering a different conversation with a different group of students. But one of the things that's going to be happening, for example, in Kentucky, is that we're going to see more and more soft pines and other softwood trees that you see like down in Florida and Georgia and so forth, moving into our hardwood forests, right? I mean, that's that. I think almost all the models predict that over time, and to some degree, we're already seeing some northward shifts in that way. Species, right? We already know that species the number of species are under some, are migrating in some sort of ways in response to climate. Now, they also migrate for other reasons, population growth and development and so forth. But one of the things that is particularly at issue that's sort of looming more in Florida is the increased incidence of tropical diseases in Florida. We've got Zika virus, we've got I was just about to say it, and then I'm sorry? Red algae. Okay, so we're talking about that in just a moment, the red algae. So, dengue fever. Okay, so I mean, we used to not have any dengue fever in the continental United States, right? But there have been incidents in Florida now. Why? Because we have this sort of northward shift was coming to us from the Caribbean and Latin America. Okay, it's just that's happening. So key. Algae blooms, toxic algae, red algae, all that kind of stuff, right? And we've talked about the phenomena in the Ohio River. All right, so what we're talking about there, we've got the nutrients, we've got the increased heat and humidity, we've got so again making it conditions right for more growth and so forth. And so that's a serious problem in Florida. And so you get people being exposed to toxins in the air, toxins in the water from the growth of algae, not even taking into account all the effects on fishing and that kind of thing. Okay, so that's a significant concern. Why might that be more of a concern for lower income or minority populations? Okay, maybe drinking water. Okay, well, generally, now we do find variations in drinking water in some communities based on where what kind of neighborhoods and so forth, whether they're low income and minority or not. But having said that, some of that has to do with actually the pipes and the infrastructure. Okay, so that's a little bit different situation. Some of it has to do with where they get their water, but a little bit less so with drinking water. More.
Do you think it takes away their access to like root infrastructure, being able to swim or cool down and things like that?
Exactly. Exactly, right? Okay, so think about if you have very limited financial resources, okay, you're more likely to want to go to the public beach, right? You're more likely to want to, have access to local waterways and so forth, local parks and so forth. But again, if you have the toxic algae bloom, right, and you've got all this stuff, right, and you're probably not going and paying admission to the museum to spend your afternoon, right? I mean, that's just, and you may or may not have as much information. You might not have as much access to information about, these various sorts of threats that are out there that you need to be careful about, okay? So, absolutely. Okay, what else? We've got one more here, which, yes.
Participation from local citizens.
Okay, participation. And the problem refers to four things. Participation, inclusion, capacity building, and empowerment. Okay, and this can look like just like a bunch of high-sounding words. And so, what do they really mean? Anything different? And the answer is yes. Each has an important meaning. So, participation is about the opportunity to have some sort of to express your voice to some sort of degree in a decision-making process. But participation can be at times very top-down rather than bottom-up. Right? So you get a bunch of government officials. They have to make a decision. So they say, hey, we're going to have a participatory process where we have a hearing. Okay, they post a notice in the newspaper. They post a notice on the internet. Anybody who wants to have some sort of input into the Tampa Bay Parks Plan can show up and speak at a hearing at 2:30 in the afternoon on Tuesday. Okay, that is participation, but that is not a very inclusive kind of participation for people who are working at 2:30 on Tuesday afternoon, who do not have easy transportation access to go down to wherever the hearing is going to be held, who do not, who don't have, easy wireless access to be able to read the park plan online, for whom English is not their primary language and might not really understand what is in the park plan and so on and so forth. So the concept of inclusion, part of this is there's a really great article in the planning literature about the relationship between participation and inclusion, and they're not the same thing. And then inclusion is more about considering and involving diverse perspectives in decision making, and it does not require that you. It's not what we call self-determination. It's not like this neighborhood over here gets to make the decisions. That's still you have government and you have government decision makers. But the idea is that you instead of just this sort of top-down process, you actually involve a diverse range of groups in designing the decision-making process or implementing the decision-making process. And so that's the idea. And it emphasizes diversity of perspective, listening to diverse perspectives, that kind of thing. So that's inclusion. And you can see that there's some relationship between inclusion and multi-stakeholder processes. We talked about multi-stakeholder processes in an earlier class, and there's some relationship there. They're not exactly the same, but there's some. Capacity building is about how you might invest in efforts to increase the capacity of communities that have fewer resources, that have historically been marginalized or oppressed or discriminated against, whatever, to have more involvement in decision-making processes, to have more ability to shape the decisions that affect their neighborhoods, that sort of thing. So capacity building is about sort of investing in the community's capacity. So that involves a whole variety of things. One of the things you're going to hear from time to time is the term social capital. Okay, social capital is a concept that is out there. It has appears in lots of different fields of study, but it's basically the idea that things like cooperation, trust, information sharing, that kind of thing is actually economically valuable. Our society works better, our economy works better when people have what's called social capital, when they have the ability to work together. And that conflict and distrust and those sorts of things are actually harmful to the communities, harmful to the economy, harmful to society, and so forth, or are a drag on that. So building social capital in lower-income communities of color makes a difference. Now, when we say that, we have to be careful because it is a mistake to assume that low-income communities of color lack social capital in all cases, or that they have no capacity. Now we have to somebody has to step in and create capacity. Okay, very often communities do have a fair amount of capacity from within, and they do have a fair amount of social capital. But one of the questions is how do we sort of help communities or work with communities to mobilize that for influencing environmental policies and environmental laws, environmental decisions. That ends up being the issue. So it is a mistake. It is actually a prejudice or a bias to think they all are sort of helpless. Right? That's not we don't want to go there because that's not true. But there are varying degrees of capacity depending on what's going on. And so, for example, one of the things that we know is that there are more gaps in capacity when there's a lot of crime and violence happening in a community than when there's not, right? That makes sense. And so that's one of the things we want to think about. And then empowerment is about how the communities can develop not just capacity, but actually power, have the ability to influence decisions, right? And so that's kind of the next step of that. Okay, good. Other issues or things that we want to address. Okay, so we've got a variety of issues here. We're understanding now. We understand a lot about the context. We're going to talk a little bit more about the communities then. So let's go there. When we talk about context, and let's start with environmental context. We're talking about the communities affected by all of these issues, the communities that we, our client, are working with. What are some of the environmental conditions or circumstances? So, obviously things like climate change and urban heat island effects and black and green infrastructure are key. But what else? Let's talk this, dig a little deeper into the facts presented here. Let's tackle them. Where in the Tampa Bay metropolitan area are low-income communities of color? Where are they?
By the University of South Florida, north of downtown.
Okay, by the University of South Florida, north of downtown. Okay, good. So they're there. Are they all there? No, what?
Also east of town.
Okay, East Tampa. Okay. Yeah. What else?
Dallas Park.
Okay.
Pasco County altogether.
Okay.
And some parts of West Tampa, but not very much.
Okay, some parts of West Tampa. All right. So what are we seeing here, right? What we're seeing here is that there's sort of a geographic range, right? We're not talking about one neighborhood in one area. We've got a wide range of neighborhoods that we're talking about, right? Okay, so that's important because it affects how we're going to go about representing these communities, right? Our job is not one neighborhood on one issue, but it's a range of neighborhoods, many of whom share common issues and problems, but they're not all going to have exactly the same issue or problem, right? They're not all in the same area. So There's some sort of geographic dispersion. Okay, what else? So, one of the things is, see, the issues like have brownfields, they lack green and other contaminated sites of contamination, they lack green blue infrastructure, they have urban heat island effects, there's vulnerable to climate change, right? So we got all those. Anything else on the environmental? Okay. Right, we'll social, political, economic, and cultural. What's the context here?
Most of the residents, I think 88%, that live in poverty in Tampa are people of color. So a huge number of the most vulnerable population are people of color.
Right. Okay. So we have some. We're going to sort of think about a Venn diagram, right? And so forth. We have actually quite a bit of overlap between low-income populations and populations of color. Okay. And again, geographically concentrated in neighborhoods. So one of the other things that we didn't really talk about from the environmental standpoint, although it could possibly be really more social, is that we're talking about neighborhoods where we have high concentrations of both low-income people and people of color. So when we talk about people of color, that's a very broad term. What are we talking about?
Latinos and African Americans, some indigenous, and then some Native Pacific Islander.
Okay, so some combinations. Okay, so we have both. I mean, a fairly significant percentage in the Tampa Bay area who are African American or Black, and a fairly significant proportion who are Latino or Hispanic. Right? Okay, so those are pretty big. So fairly sizable parts of our communities of color. Right? So, we'll talk a little bit more about the Latino communities in just a moment. Just kind of what we're talking about. Try to write that down a little bit more. I've got some more to kind of talk about with that. But what else? What's some of the other sort of economic or political context here?
In addition to minority populations, there's a lot of English second language residents.
Okay, good. Right, so a lot of the residents do not speak English as their first language. Okay, so that's significant. Good. Okay.
Because of past issues with the government, they may not be as open to trust right now.
So there may be some distrust there because of the. What about that? Yeah, go ahead.
I would say especially there's a decent population that's undocumented as well, so they might be even getting involved with the government.
Okay, good, good. What about the economic context here? I mean, you had some reading about the Tampa Bay area generally.
There's no incentive for tax dollars in the community that no much tax base, so we're not really feeling putting money there.
Okay, so one of the basic problems that arises here are fiscal incentives and disincentives. The question is, what kind of investment is the government going to make in or private sector, either way. So either government or private sector, what kind of investment is going to be made in lower income communities. And if a lower income community becomes the object of investment, either by the government or by private sector, what likely generally happens? We've talked about this before, but what's we got?
It pushes low income out. So we only have housing prices go up, and a big scenario, honestly, you have more food deserts for the low income.
Right, because now people are moving to other communities because they can no longer afford the neighborhood that they were in. So we get what's called gentrification and displacement. And this is one of the nuances I want to emphasize because for a long time we just throw around the word gentrification. Like gentrification now means that all the low-income people, all the people of color are now moving out. That's not true. Okay, so actually the word displacement gets at that. And so what we've learned is to sort of see these dynamics that sometimes neighborhood improvements actually end up strengthening the neighborhood. And for the most part, the neighborhood population is not being displaced. That doesn't mean everybody. I mean, but for the most part, you do not have it all turning into white, wealthy, fancy schmancy development. Right? It ends up being much more organic, much more mixed, and so forth, and people do not end up being priced out of the neighborhood for the most part, that kind of thing. So gentrification does not always mean displacement, but that combination of gentrification and displacement is a problem. Right? What else? Okay, go ahead.
I would say one of the big industries is tourism, and especially with climate change, they might need to change that.
Right. Okay. So there may be some parts of the economy that are vulnerable. Okay. And so tourism is an example. But just think about a number of sort of businesses that if you had a Katrina-style climate disaster, right? I mean, all of a sudden you've got businesses that are shut down, businesses that decide to move elsewhere, right? There's some risk there, right? The economy bears some of this risk of all of this, right? Okay, so that is a challenge. But also look at, there's a fair amount of economic activity, economic growth and investment in the Tampa Bay area, right? I mean, that's sort of, but what you get with that then is then when we're looking at comparisons to the information about low-income populations, there's obviously a decent amount of economic inequality, right? So this economic inequality is just part of the context in which we're talking about. Not everybody is realizing the benefits of that economic investment and growth. Okay? Yeah.
When, like we heard on the last field trip that we did, there's probably a lot of money in the community, like going to the community, but it doesn't stay in the community. It comes out, so especially like if there's hotel fees and everything, that money is just going all straight to the hotels, which are not based in the community.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and so how do you get how do you funnel more of sort of the that income and the tax base and so forth back into the communities? Okay, good. Let me. We could talk on about some other aspects of this. It is worth noting that there's a bay, right? So this, big bay, right? And it is on the Gulf of Mexico, right? So you've got all of that sort of the aspects of it being sort of a warm, sunny climate, the beaches and so on and so forth. And so there are going to be some ways in which that affects how you go about solving this problem or thinking about the problem that are different than if you were in Detroit, right? Right? I mean, we sort of see that. I mean, Detroit would be a very different kind of context just in terms of what everybody does and the culture and so on and so forth, okay? As well as the environment. Institutional context. So this is governance. When we talk about governance, what is the governance? Well, obviously, we have the same sort of things that we talked about all semester long at the federal level. Okay, so you've got multiple federal agencies, you've got Congress, the executive, and the courts. And so you've got governance at the federal level of a variety of sorts. State level. Okay, now you don't get as much from the reading on this, but let me give you a couple of things about Florida on the state level, which is there's a very kind of interesting dynamic in Florida in terms of the relationship between the state government and local government. Okay, so state government, to some degree, is more involved in what happens at the local level than is true in many states. Okay? Now it depends on where you come from, what your background, and where state you come from. So that's not be true with I mean, there are other states where the state government is more involved, but there are, for example, state planning requirements for local governments. They have been somewhat lessened and weakened in recent years, but they're there. Water. Okay, so both water quality and water usage are controlled in a relatively systematic, integrated way by regional water districts. And so there are these 5 major regional water districts around the state that where sort of really have to, for all sorts of things, you have to go and get permits from the regional water district under state law. Okay, so without going into you don't need to know a whole lot more than that that's the case. But Florida is actually the best example nationally of what's called regulated riparianism. Okay, so the riparian doctrine is a doctrine of water rights in the eastern part of the United States, and Florida, for a variety of political and historic reasons, back I think in the 70s, adopted a system of sort of integrated water management with these 5 regional water management districts. Okay, so that is so in other words, you're going to see more state law, more state involvement in what happens locally. But let's talk about locally. Who's the government?
The municipal government.
What municipal government?
Tampa's municipal government.
What's that? Okay, is that one government? Multiple municipalities. What you said? County? One county? No. That's 2 counties, right? Right? Tampa Bay area, how many counties? 5? 5 counties, right? Okay, so you see where I'm going with this? Okay, so I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, so we start breaking this down. We've got, I mean, just right there with Tampa and St. Petersburg, we've got Hillsborough and Pinellas counties. That's 2 counties, right? We've got St. Petersburg, we've got Tampa, we've got what else? Clearwater, right? I mean, you start breaking it down, you've got a whole bunch of different municipalities. If we talk about the metropolitan area, that's 5 counties, right? It's a whole bunch of municipalities. Okay, this is not uncommon in urban areas. Okay, and I think I might have mentioned this before, but Louisville is unique. Well, not unique. Louisville is different in that we have metropolitan government. We have city county merged, and it was called merger. People talk about merger, like it was a capital M merger, a big deal. That happened, I don't know, it was 98 or something like that. And 1998, I think, was when that happened in Louisville. Indianapolis has combined city-county government. Nashville has combined city-county government. What's the common thread? All right down the road on I-65, right? Okay. Most of the rest of the United States, when you talk about a metropolitan area, you're talking about multiple counties and bunches of different cities. Okay. So if we're talking about how we're going to influence change, that's a bunch of different entities, right? A bunch of different decision makers. And so that is a challenge for us, and we just have to sort of wrestle with that. And that has legal dimensions as well as more social and political dimensions. Okay? Other thoughts? Okay. So let's come back to how we're going to frame the problem. So we've talked about a whole variety of issues. We've talked about who our client is. We've talked about the context. What is the problem? Let's build it on up to a bigger view. So you're down at the convention center. So you meet somebody, and they say, what do? You say, I am general counsel of the Tampa Bay Justice Coalition. And they say, what are you working on? And you're like, you're walking down the hall, you don't have time to go through all this. What?
The problem is how we address all these issues. In fact, we develop a comprehensive strategy to battle or to engage the community and environmental justice issues.
Okay, good. So let me sort of pull that apart and identify some pieces of it. So we're looking for a comprehensive strategy, comprehensive and probably effective, right? We probably want something that's going to be pretty effective to address environmental injustices. And we like times we just use the word environmental justice and so forth. But in this particular case, let's sort of call it what it is, which is our environmental injustices that affect a range of low-income communities of color. So now you see I've got the range in there because we are talking about different neighborhoods. Maybe some of them are Cuban American. Maybe some of them are primarily Puerto Rican. Maybe some of them are primarily black, right? I mean, so we've got various kinds of groups of people of color, but they all are low-income and they are predominantly communities of color. But there's a range of them in the Tampa Bay metropolitan area, in ways that result in environmental justice, in ways that improve the environmental and health conditions of these communities. And so there's a couple different ways. One of the things we want to say is, and engage those communities in decision making. That's another piece of it, right? Okay, so that's not the only way to frame it. There's lots of different ways to frame it. So I'm not suggesting that that if you have a different sort of framing, that's wrong. Not at all. Right? That's so there are different ways to frame it. But what I'm trying to get at here is that you want to be thinking about the fact that there is some overarching theme to what you're doing here, right? It's not just a set of 6 issues to hit on the exam, IRAC it, and move on, right? I mean, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a problem-solving approach. We're looking at a comprehensive environmental justice strategy for a range of communities in the metropolitan area that have some common issues and problems. Right? And then you can get into each of the issues and what's going on here. Okay. Questions?
So when we're discussing the Tampa area, what do we want to limit it to? Because the problem kind of says, well, there's like this 8-county area, and you have the 5-county area,
right?
And so, I mean, are we just kind of
like anything and anything that could be attached to Tampa.
Right. Okay. So what do you think? Based on the sort of the instructions, the way the problems are written, what do you think? So let me ask this: if you think that you focus just on the city of Tampa, is that going to be sufficient to meet what you've been asked to do? No, of course not. Right. Okay. What's the challenge with the 8-county area?
A lot of the, the kind of people mentioned, particularly Colin specifically mentioned, Oakland and Dallas are pretty rural counties, so they don't necessarily get a lot of same urban problems that just do bigger counties.
Right, exactly. And the 8-county region is, I think, if I remember right, the reference is specifically for sort of economic analysis, sort of economic development as a broader region. And so, yeah, you do run the risk that it's just too big, right? You're now dealing with a lot of rural communities that don't really have the same kinds of urban problems that a smaller. So whether you're looking at more just a 3-county area or a 5-county area, you're at least now focusing more to the urban dimensions of the metropolitan area, right? Does that make sense? So, I mean, again, you can make different choices, but that's what seems reasonable on the basis of the instructions you've been given, and also manageable. I mean, just sort of think through the, you can get too big, and now you're solving, all the environmental problems of the entire southeastern part of the United States, and it just becomes too big, right? So, what else? Okay, so on Wednesday we're going to dive into brownfields and CERCLA, and this is going to be sort of the biggest part of technical law, right? So that's so we're going to really dive into that, and then each of the subsequent topics has law to it, but it becomes the analysis between other things, policy and social and so forth.